Nuclear catastrophe. Is it possible? What would happen to New York? The possibility of a nuclear strike on New York is a scenario that defies imagination. Yet it serves as a stark reminder of the fragile balance of global security. The immediate consequences would be catastrophic, with the epicenter of the explosion reduced to ash in moments, and the surrounding areas facing unimaginable destruction. Millions of lives would be lost or irreversibly altered in an instant, with countless others left to deal with the physical and psychological scars of such an event. The heat and shockwave from a nuclear detonation would not only destroy buildings, but also ignite fires across the city, overwhelming emergency services and leaving survivors without immediate aid. Those further from the blast would face exposure to radioactive fallout, a silent and deadly threat that could spread far beyond the initial impact zone, contaminating the air, water, and soil. The destruction of New York, a cornerstone of global finance, culture, and diplomacy, would send shockwaves through the global economy, destabilizing markets and disrupting the lives of people worldwide. Communication networks, power grids, and essential infrastructure would likely collapse, creating chaos and impeding any rescue or recovery efforts. The psychological impact of such an event cannot be overstated. Fear, panic, and uncertainty would grip not just those directly affected, but also the global population. Trust in governments and institutions might erode, and societies could face heightened tensions, both internally and internationally. On a larger scale, the political ramifications would be immense. The use of nuclear weapons would undoubtedly escalate geopolitical tensions, risking further conflicts and even additional nuclear strikes. The environmental consequences, including the potential for a nuclear winter, could alter the planet's climate, threatening ecosystems and food supplies far beyond the immediate area of the attack. While such a scenario is terrifying to contemplate, it also underscores the urgent need for international cooperation to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. The importance of dialogue, disarmament, and the promotion of peace cannot be overstated. In a world where the stakes are this high, humanity must prioritize unity over division and strive to ensure that such a catastrophe remains firmly in the realm of the unimaginable. If a nuclear disaster were to occur, the immediate and long-term consequences would be devastating, altering life as we know it. Here is a breakdown of what might happen in such a scenario. A nuclear explosion would instantly obliterate everything within several kilometers of the detonation point, creating a fireball with temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Buildings, infrastructure, and people within the blast radius would be vaporized or severely damaged. Intense heat would cause widespread fires and ignite flammable materials over vast areas. A powerful shockwave would flatten structures and injure or kill people far beyond the blast zone. Immediate radiation from the explosion would cause acute radiation sickness in survivors near the epicenter. Radioactive fallout, carried by wind, would contaminate areas hundreds of kilometers away, posing an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, could disable electronic devices, cutting off communication and crippling emergency response systems. Millions would die instantly, and countless others would suffer from severe burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. Hospitals and medical services would be overwhelmed, unable to cope with the scale of the disaster. Survivors in the fallout zone would be forced to evacuate, creating a massive refugee crisis. Food, water, and medical supplies would become scarce, leading to further suffering and loss of life. The trauma of witnessing such destruction would have long-lasting effects on mental health, both for survivors and those witnessing the aftermath from afar. Soil, water, and air in the affected regions would be heavily contaminated, rendering large areas uninhabitable for decades. Crops and livestock would be affected, leading to food shortages. Massive fires from urban areas could release soot into the atmosphere, potentially causing nuclear winter. A drop in global temperatures could lead to failed harvests and famine on a global scale. A single nuclear event could provoke retaliation, escalating into a larger conflict involving multiple countries and additional nuclear strikes. A global political alliances could fracture, leading to instability and potential war. Major financial hubs, industries, and trade networks could be destroyed or disrupted, triggering a global economic crisis. Rebuilding efforts would require massive resources, further straining economies. Rebuilding infrastructure, homes, and livelihoods in affected areas would take decades, if not longer. Generations would bear the social and economic burdens of the disaster. Survivors would face long-term health issues, including cancers and genetic mutations from radiation exposure. Mental health crises would become a widespread issue in both affected areas and globally. The destruction of key cities and regions could lead to shifts in global power dynamics, creating uncertainty and instability. While humanity has the capacity to respond to disasters, the scale of a nuclear catastrophe would test our limits. It would serve as a grim reminder of the need for diplomacy, disarmament, and unity to prevent such tragedies from ever occurring. If a nuclear weapon strikes the center of New York City, the consequences for New York State and the entire United States will be catastrophic. Millions of people would die instantly from the explosion and fire, while many others would suffer from radiation and the collapse of buildings. The areas around the city would be devastated, and towns and cities hundreds of kilometers away would face radioactive fallout, making many places uninhabitable. The economy would collapse, not just in the U.S. but globally, as New York is a financial and cultural hub. Banks, stock exchanges, businesses, and infrastructure like bridges, tunnels, and subways would be destroyed. People would be left without water, electricity, communication, or medical help. Many would flee the city, creating a refugee crisis that would affect other states. For America, it would be both an economic and social disaster. People across the country would live in fear, lose trust in the government, and experience widespread stress. The political consequences would be severe. Other countries might try to exploit the U.S.'s weakened state, and international relations could worsen. There is also the risk of escalation if the U.S. retaliates, leading to further conflicts. Radioactive fallout would contaminate agriculture, water, and air, causing food shortages and health problems. Rebuilding New York would take decades, and many areas might never recover fully. This disaster would change life, not just for New Yorkers but for all Americans. The long-term effects of such a catastrophe would ripple through every aspect of American life. Survivors in and around New York would face decades of health issues, including cancers and radiation-related illnesses. Mental health crises would become widespread as people struggle to cope with the trauma and loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. Cities far from the blast zone would be overwhelmed by displaced people seeking safety, creating pressure on already limited resources like housing, healthcare, and food supplies. The United States infrastructure, already heavily dependent on New York as a key hub for finance, trade, and governance, would be severely disrupted. The loss of one of the country's most iconic cities would leave an emotional and cultural void, altering the identity of the nation. Iconic landmarks, museums, and historical sites would be gone, and the task of rebuilding would seem insurmountable. Globally, the U.S. would likely lose much of its influence and leadership. The attack would signal a vulnerability that could embolden adversaries and weaken alliances. Countries reliant on U.S. stability and leadership would face their own crises, further destabilizing international systems. The environmental impact would also linger for years, as radiation spreads through ecosystems and poisons water supplies and farmland. This would lead to food shortages not just in the U.S., but potentially in countries that depend on American agricultural exports. Rebuilding would require massive economic resources, yet the collapse of financial systems would make recovery painfully slow. For decades, generations would feel the weight of this event in higher taxes, strained public services, and a fundamentally altered way of life. Such an event would serve as a grim reminder of the fragility of peace and the devastating potential of nuclear weapons. It would underscore the urgent need for international cooperation, disarmament, and a commitment to ensuring such a tragedy never happens. While humanity has always shown resilience in the face of disaster, the scale of this destruction would test the limits of that resilience like never before. The social fabric of the United States would face unprecedented strain. Communities across the nation, already grappling with fear and uncertainty, might fracture under the weight of political divisions and resource shortages. Mistrust in the government's ability to prevent or respond to such a disaster could lead to protests, civil unrest, and political upheaval. Regional rivalries might emerge as states attempt to manage the influx of displaced people, further complicating the national recovery. Education systems, healthcare networks, and local economies would feel the long-term effects of the disaster. With so many lives lost and infrastructure destroyed, schools, hospitals, and businesses would struggle to adapt. Generational trauma would affect children growing up in the shadow of such a catastrophe, shaping how they view the world and their place in it. Globally, the aftermath of a nuclear strike on New York would send shockwaves through international diplomacy. Nations might scramble to re-evaluate their own security policies, leading to an arms race as countries seek to protect themselves from similar attacks. The focus on retribution or defense could overshadow critical issues like climate change, poverty, and global health, creating a more fragmented and hostile world. The cultural impact would also be profound. The destruction of New York, a symbol of resilience, diversity, and creativity, would leave an irreplaceable void. Art, literature, and media would grapple with the magnitude of the loss, shaping global narratives about humanity's capacity for both destruction and recovery. Efforts to rebuild New York and stabilize the U.S. would likely spark innovations in technology, energy, and urban planning. However, the pace of recovery would depend on the unity and determination of the American people and the support of international allies. The lessons learned from such a tragedy could drive a renewed commitment to preventing nuclear war and fostering global peace, but only if leaders and citizens alike prioritize collaboration and empathy over division and fear. Ultimately, while the immediate effects of a nuclear strike on New York would be devastating, the long-term recovery would be a test of humanity's ability to rebuild, heal, and adapt in the face of overwhelming adversity. The question would not only be whether the U.S. could recover, but also how the world would change in response to such a defining moment in history. The long-term psychological impact on the global population would be immense. The destruction of New York City, a symbol of modern civilization, would embed a deep sense of vulnerability in people worldwide. Fear of further attacks could lead to widespread anxiety, mistrust, and a shift toward isolationism in both personal and national policies. The cultural memory of such a catastrophe would shape the narratives of future generations, creating stories of loss, resilience, and the dangers of unchecked power. The international community would be forced to grapple with the implications of a nuclear attack on a major global city. Diplomatic relations could polarize, as nations align themselves in blocs either to de-escalate tensions or to prepare for future conflicts. Non-nuclear countries might accelerate efforts to develop their own weapons, further destabilizing the global balance of power. Conversely, this disaster might serve as a wake-up call, spurring unprecedented global cooperation toward disarmament and peace. The environment would continue to bear the scars of the attack for decades. Radiation would disrupt ecosystems, killing off species and altering natural cycles. Contaminated rivers and soil would spread toxins into surrounding areas, creating zones of ecological collapse. Climate patterns could be affected if enough soot and debris entered the atmosphere, potentially leading to cooler temperatures and reduced agricultural yields, exacerbating global food insecurity. For the survivors, life would never return to normal. Those who escaped the immediate devastation would carry both physical and emotional wounds, grappling with survivors' guilt and long-term health complications. Entire generations in the affected areas would grow up in a world shaped by loss, rebuilding their lives amidst the ruins of what once was. Economically, the recovery would be long and arduous. The United States would face enormous costs not only in rebuilding infrastructure, but also in addressing the social and political aftershocks. Global markets would shift, with countries and corporations reconfiguring their strategies in response to the new geopolitical landscape. It could take decades for the U.S. to regain its former economic and cultural influence, if ever. As society adjusted to the new reality, technological and scientific advancements might emerge as a response to the disaster. Innovations in clean energy, urban design, and disaster preparedness could be prioritized, potentially leading to a safer and more sustainable future. However, this progress would come at a steep price, built on the lessons of unimaginable tragedy. The ultimate question would remain: could humanity unite to ensure that such an event never happens again? The disaster would serve as a harrowing reminder of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons and the urgent need for global unity, diplomacy, and disarmament. The legacy of such a tragedy would depend on whether the world chose to learn from it or repeat the mistakes that led to it. As the years pass, the world would likely face a dual challenge: preserving the memory of the tragedy to prevent future conflicts while striving to move beyond its shadow. Memorials and commemorations would become a central part of rebuilding New York and the United States, honoring those lost and serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of nuclear warfare. However, the psychological scars might take generations to heal, as the fear of another attack lingers. Politically, the disaster could reshape the very fabric of international governance. The United Nations and other global institutions might be pressured to reform, potentially giving rise to stronger enforcement mechanisms to prevent nuclear proliferation. New treaties and coalitions could emerge, emphasizing global security and crisis management. On the other hand, mistrust between nations could grow, leading to heightened tensions and a new era of competition for dominance. Within the United States, the rebuilding process would redefine its national identity. The loss of New York would leave a cultural and financial vacuum, prompting other cities to rise in prominence. Washington, D.C., or cities like Chicago or Los Angeles might take on greater roles in finance, media, and culture. However, this shift would come with challenges as infrastructure, talent, and investment realign in a post-catastrophe landscape. Survivors and displaced populations would shape the narrative of recovery, becoming symbols of resilience and hope. Communities would likely form tight bonds as they rebuild together, fostering a sense of unity that could redefine societal values. Grassroots organizations and local leaders might gain influence, emphasizing the importance of community-based recovery efforts in the absence of immediate national solutions. Advancements in technology and science would likely accelerate in response to the catastrophe. Space exploration might gain new momentum as humanity seeks alternatives to Earth-based vulnerabilities. Innovations in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and biotechnology could emerge as part of efforts to rebuild and prevent future crises. These developments might propel humanity forward, turning tragedy into a catalyst for progress. Despite these potential advances, the shadow of the attack would loom large. Art, literature, and media would reflect the themes of loss, resilience, and the fragility of human civilization. The event would become a defining moment in history, influencing global culture for generations. It might inspire a renewed appreciation for peace and cooperation or, conversely, deepen divisions and fears. Ultimately, the world's ability to recover and thrive after such a disaster would depend on collective action. The choices made in the aftermath, whether to unite or to divide, to innovate or to stagnate, would determine the legacy of this unprecedented tragedy. While humanity has always shown remarkable resilience, the scale of this disaster would test the very limits of that resilience, leaving an indelible mark on the course of history. As time progresses, the long-term effects of a nuclear strike on New York would continue to ripple through all facets of society, shaping politics, culture, and even the trajectory of human civilization. Survivors would face a transformed world, one that balances between hope for recovery and the lingering specter of further destruction. Global cooperation would likely face its greatest test. While some nations might come together to address the shared risks of nuclear weapons and commit to disarmament, others might exploit the instability for their own advantage. This duality could lead to either a renewed era of diplomacy and peace or a fragmented world of competing powers, each racing to bolster its defenses. Within the United States, the psychological impact would permeate every level of society. Families who lost loved ones, homes, and livelihoods would carry generational trauma. Schools, workplaces, and communities across the country would adapt to a new reality, one where emergency preparedness and resilience become cornerstones of daily life. Public demand for stronger leadership and accountability would reshape the political landscape, potentially giving rise to movements focused on rebuilding trust in government and preventing future disasters. The cultural void left by the destruction of New York would inspire both mourning and creativity. Artists, writers, and filmmakers would process the event through their work, creating narratives that explore loss, survival, and renewal. This creative response might help society heal, while also ensuring that the lessons of the tragedy are preserved for future generations. Economically, the United States would embark on one of the most ambitious reconstruction efforts in history. Rebuilding New York or creating a new financial and cultural hub would require massive investment, innovation, and international support. The process could serve as a proving ground for cutting-edge technologies in construction, renewable energy, and urban planning, potentially setting a new standard for sustainable cities. However, this progress would not come evenly. Some regions might flourish, while others struggle to recover from the economic shock. Globally, the attack would redefine the balance of power. The United States, despite its losses, would likely retain significant influence, but other nations might rise in prominence as they step into roles once dominated by America. Alliances would shift, with countries reassessing their security strategies and forming new partnerships in response to the changing geopolitical landscape. The environmental consequences would continue to shape policy and priorities. Large-scale efforts to decontaminate affected areas might lead to advancements in environmental science and technology. At the same time, the fear of nuclear fallout could accelerate global efforts to combat other existential threats, such as climate change. Looking forward, humanity would face a pivotal choice: to either let the tragedy deepen divisions and fears, or to use it as a catalyst for global unity and progress. The event would remain a powerful reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization. Whether as a cautionary tale or a turning point in history, the legacy of such a disaster would forever influence how humanity views its place in the universe and its responsibility to one another. As the decades pass, the event would transition from an immediate crisis to a defining chapter in history, shaping how future generations understand war, peace, and the fragility of human existence. Institutions and governments worldwide would continue grappling with the lessons of the catastrophe, creating systems and policies designed to ensure such a tragedy could never occur again. In education, the nuclear attack on New York would become a central topic in history and political science curricula. Students would study the event not just as a warning of destruction, but as an opportunity to explore the resilience of humanity, the importance of international cooperation, and the ethical implications of wielding such power. The event could inspire a generation of leaders, scientists, and activists dedicated to preventing similar disasters. Survivors and their descendants would play a key role in shaping the narrative. Their stories of loss, courage, and survival would become essential for understanding the human cost of nuclear conflict. Memorials and museums would be built to preserve these stories, serving as spaces for reflection, learning, and remembrance. Technologically, humanity might enter a new era driven by the need for greater security and sustainability. Advances in renewable energy, urban design, and artificial intelligence could emerge, addressing vulnerabilities exposed by the disaster. Space exploration might accelerate, as nations seek to establish colonies on other planets to safeguard humanity against existential risks on Earth. Culturally, the world would likely see a renaissance of art and media addressing themes of destruction and renewal. Books, films, and music would reflect the collective trauma and hope of rebuilding, serving as a means of healing and a call to action for a more peaceful future. Art could bridge divides, creating shared experiences that foster understanding and empathy across nations. On the global stage, the event would remain a stark reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy. International organizations, strengthened by the memory of the tragedy, might enforce stricter controls on weapon proliferation and foster deeper collaboration to address global challenges. Alternatively, if the lessons are ignored, the world could spiral into an arms race, with nations prioritizing self-preservation over collective security. As humanity rebuilds, the moral and philosophical questions raised by the event would continue to resonate. Debates about the ethics of war, the balance of power, and the role of technology in shaping the future would dominate academic, political, and public discourse. These conversations would influence how humanity approaches other existential threats, such as climate change, pandemics, and artificial intelligence. Ultimately, the legacy of a nuclear strike on New York would not be defined solely by the destruction it caused, but by how humanity responded. If the world could unite to rebuild, heal, and learn, the event might serve as a turning point toward a more cooperative and resilient future. Conversely, if divisions deepen and the lessons are forgotten, the tragedy could mark the beginning of a more dangerous and uncertain era. The choice would lie with humanity itself, and the stakes could not be higher. In the aftermath of a nuclear catastrophe, the world would face an unparalleled challenge that tests the very limits of human resilience, innovation, and cooperation. Such an event would forever alter the course of history, shaping how nations interact, how societies rebuild, and how humanity safeguards its future. It would serve as both a harrowing reminder of the devastating consequences of war and a profound opportunity to come together for a more secure and peaceful world. The path forward would depend on our collective ability to learn, adapt, and unite. Let's continue to explore these critical topics and work toward a brighter future together. Subscribe to the channel to stay informed, engage in meaningful discussions, and join a community committed to understanding and shaping the world we live in.